my selfish husband has forced me to leave my job, and now I feel completely trapped. I've been married to my husband, Matt, for 5 years now. From the outside, our marriage has always seemed perfect. He is a caring husband and takes me out on occasional dates whenever he gets some time. We have a solid marriage with the give and take that you would expect from a committed relationship. But recently, I felt like our relationship has turned into something ugly. Like Matt isn't the partner he used to be. Instead, it feels like he's been using me all along and I've been blind to it. Worse still, I allowed myself to be taken advantage of repeatedly, despite the nagging feelings that something wasn't right between us. It's been a hard pill to swallow, but the more I think about it, the more I see the patterns I missed before. First of all, I have noticed that my husband has become incredibly pushy, especially after his mother moved in with us. He bulldozes his way through things to get what he wants, and when I push back or try to stand up for myself, the situation somehow always twists around. Secondly, he has this way of turning himself into a victim, even though he's the one responsible for the hurt and manipulation. I understand that it's classic gaslighting. He'll make me question my reality, my feelings, as if I'm the one in the wrong for even questioning him when really he's the one creating the problem. Late last year, my husband's mother fell seriously ill. My mother-in-law had already gone through the grief of losing her husband, and with my husband being her only child, the responsibility of her care naturally fell on us. There weren't many options left on the table. Either we could send her to a care facility, which my husband wasn't comfortable with, or she could come to live with us full time. Now, don't get me wrong, I used to like my mother-in-law before. In the time that we had spent together over the years, I had always enjoyed her company. But liking someone is one thing, and living with them 24/7 is another entirely. There's a significant difference between meeting my mother-in-law on various occasions and sharing my entire living space with her, with no breaks in between. This was a level of constant interaction and responsibility that I just wasn't ready for. I knew that taking her in would mean not only to be there for her emotionally or giving her a place to stay, but it was also about all the day-to-day care, the physical and mental workload that would come with looking after someone who was so unwell. And knowing my husband the way I do, I had a sinking feeling that the bulk of that responsibility would fall squarely on my shoulders. I anticipated that despite his promises of "we'll handle it together," I'd end up being the one managing most of the caregiving, running errands and dealing with the emotional strain of having my mother-in-law live with us. However, my husband kept insisting that he wanted his mother to live with us. At the time, we were both juggling our own jobs. I had a stable, well-paying position, earning twice as much as my husband because I'd been with my company for a long time. Meanwhile, he had lost his previous high-paying job and was working as a freelancer as well as a part-time server, trying to find better opportunities and without any level of financial security. The disparity in our incomes was already adding pressure to our relationship, and now this conversation about his mother added another layer. This is why I didn't shy away from expressing my concerns. I told him firmly that it would be impossible to bring his mother into our home under the circumstances. We both had busy schedules, long hours, intense workloads, and neither of us could afford to stay home full time to look after her. Caring for her properly would require attention and time we simply didn't have. I wanted to be reasonable, but the reality of our situation was weighing heavily on me. In response, my husband assured me over and over that his mother didn't want or need constant care. He insisted that she wasn't asking for anyone to hover over her or watch her every move. According to him, she just wanted a quiet room to live in, and that's all. He even went as far as to promise that any additional care or needs she might have would be his responsibility, not mine. Despite my skepticism, he seemed so certain, so determined to make it work. He also guilted me further into agreeing by talking about how his ailing mother was getting older and how scared he was of losing her. He said that it was important to him to have her close. I could sense his vulnerability in that moment, and it was difficult for me to push back any further. Despite my misgivings, I begrudgingly agreed to let her move in with us. Although I wasn't convinced that it was the right choice for our situation, I felt cornered by his emotional plea. When my mother-in-law first moved in with us, things seemed manageable for me. She was polite, helpful, and mostly kept to herself. It felt like for a brief period we had found a balance. I was hopeful that maybe this arrangement wouldn't be as overwhelming as I had initially feared. She seemed content with her space, and I tried to make sure I was welcoming, despite my reservations. However, as the days turned into weeks, small cracks began to appear. Slowly but surely, her comments about how things were run in the house started creeping in. It began subtly, remarks about how our house wasn't being kept up to her standards. Now, I've always been someone who takes pride in my home, but I work a full-time job, and realistically, the only day I have to really catch up on all household chores is the weekend. That's when I tackled everything, cleaning, laundry, organizing, but apparently it wasn't enough for my mother-in-law. She felt like I should clean the house every other day for it to be more well-maintained. It was disheartening to hear her say something like this. Next, she started commenting about my cooking. My husband never once complained about my food before in all the years of dating and marriage, but his mother, after only living with us for weeks, started finding fault in the way I cooked my food. For instance, she would say there wasn't enough salt in my dish, or that I couldn't cook food as well as she did. At first, I would try to brush off these minor critiques, but it started getting constant. So I politely but firmly pointed out to her that she was welcome to use our kitchen and cook any meal that she wanted on her own. Going forward, I would be happy to cook for just me and my husband. This way, she would have nothing to complain about. However, my mother-in-law then started to backtrack by telling me how that was not what she wanted, and that she just liked to point out my flaws so that she could make me a better cook. As time went on, it got worse for me. If I ever came home late from work, which happened occasionally because of the demands of my job, she'd make snide comments in front of my husband about how in her generation women didn't leave the house all day, let alone work late. Instead, they stayed in the kitchen cooking meals for their husbands, and that is apparently what I should be doing. She would say this in a tone dripping with judgment, as though my late hours at work was some moral failing or a sign that I wasn't fulfilling my duties as a wife. As if these comments weren't enough, she would also throw in these little digs claiming that I had left my husband and her to starve at home till late while I was busy with work. These comments would infuriate me. It wasn't just the outdated expectations she was trying to impose. It was the way she acted, as though I was neglecting them both. I would point out that she and my husband were perfectly capable of cooking for themselves, or heating up something I had already packed in the fridge. But then my mother-in-law would act all hurt and offended, as if I was failing some sacred duty. And what was worse, my husband hardly ever stepped in to defend me or set boundaries. I felt more and more like I was being criticized for simply living my life, while my efforts to juggle work, home, and this new dynamic every day were never acknowledged by anyone. In comparison to me, my husband did nothing to help out his mother like he had promised me he would. Yet his mother never complained about him. Instead, I was made to feel like I was falling short at every turn. As a result, I started finding myself growing increasingly frustrated, not only with my mother-in-law, but with my husband's silence in the face of her constant complaints. If I ever did complain about her to him, he would try to downplay his mother's behavior, telling me things like, "Oh, don't worry, that's just how she was raised," or "She's not trying to be mean, stop taking things so personally." It didn't matter to him how those comments were affecting me or how much they chipped away at my peace of mind. He seemed to think that because she wasn't being outright nasty, I shouldn't be hurt at all. As time passed, my husband started to even side with his mother more often than not. The more she criticized me, the more I noticed him parroting her views. It was subtle at first, but it became more obvious with time. My husband used to be my cleaning partner every weekend. We had an understanding that we'd split chores and tackle things together around the house to make it easier for both of us, whether it was laundry, cleaning, or running errands. However, after my mother-in-law started making comments about how it was a woman's role to keep the house and how men shouldn't be involved in domestic work, my husband's attitude started to shift. She would even taunt him, saying things like, "Why are you doing all these chores? That's women's work." And "You're acting like a woman." I guess because of this, he started to internalize them, and slowly he stopped doing anything around the house to help me. It was shocking to watch. This was the same man who never had an issue splitting household duties before, and now, after a few comments from his mother, he was behaving like he had never agreed to share the responsibilities. If I asked him to help me clean or even do his own laundry, he would outright refuse. He'd say things like, "You do it," with no further explanation. I was completely flabbergasted. I couldn't wrap my head around how he had changed so suddenly, how he had let his mother's outdated beliefs influence him to the point where he no longer felt the need to contribute to the household. The worst part was that when I confronted him about this change, he didn't seem to understand why I was so upset. He acted as though I was overreacting, as if it was completely normal for me to handle everything while he sat back. It was as though he had taken on his mother's mindset without questioning it, and I was left wondering how, after everything we had built together, it had come to this. One day, I came home late, as usual after a long day of work, and walked into the living room to find my husband and mother-in-law sitting together, drinking wine and celebrating. At first, it seemed like a nice moment. They were in high spirits, and my husband eagerly shared some good news with me. He had finally landed a proper job with a great income, something he had been struggling to secure for a while. Naturally, I was happy for him. I gave him a hug, genuinely excited that things were turning around for him career-wise. But then the mood shifted. My husband looked at me, and there was a nervousness in his expression that I hadn't noticed before. He told me he wanted to talk about something important, and I could feel a knot forming in my stomach. Apparently, while I was at work, him and his mother had been discussing things about our relationship, and they both had come to a decision without me. My husband said that now that he had this new job, both he and his mother felt that I no longer needed to continue working. He suggested that I just quit my job and stay at home from next month onwards so that I could be more present at home. I was completely taken aback by his calm, matter-of-fact way of telling me to just quit my career like it was nothing. I looked at him. Then at my mother-in-law, trying to gauge if this was some kind of joke. Surely they couldn't be serious. But their faces told me otherwise. My mother-in-law, of course, was quick to chime in, reinforcing what my husband had just said. She told me how she had noticed that I seemed too stressed every day from balancing both work and taking care of the house, and how, as I was getting older, it would be better for me to let one of those things go. She suggested that since my husband would now be the main breadwinner, I should focus on taking care of my household duties and keeping things smooth at home for my husband. I couldn't help but scoff, partially in amusement, but mostly in disbelief. Yes, I knew she was traditional, and I had put up with a lot of her outdated opinions over the months, but this was over-the-top ridiculous. The idea that I should quit my job, a career I had worked hard to build, simply because my husband had a new job, was absurd. Not to mention the fact that they had somehow made this decision without even talking to me first and were now kind of pressuring me. It was insulting, not only to my sense of self-worth, but also to everything I had worked for. I immediately told my mother-in-law without hesitation that there was absolutely no way I was going to quit my job regardless of whether or not Matt had a job. I love my work. It's a significant part of who I am and what I've worked so hard to achieve. I wasn't going to sacrifice my career or my independence for anyone. I turned to my husband and pointed out how in all the years we've been together, he had never once expressed any real issue with my career. He never complained about my long hours or the time I spent at work. He never complained when he would depend on me to pay the bills or buy us groceries with my job. So why now? Why suddenly was he acting like my job was a problem? That's when my husband started to claim that he had always had a problem with my long hours, but had kept it to himself because at the time he couldn't provide for me. However, now he believed that he was going to be able to really be a man. He continued to say that he and his mother had the best interest for me, and they believed that I should cut back on work so I can learn to be a more present wife for him. The phrase, present wife, struck me like a slap in the face. Suddenly, I wasn't just his partner anymore. I was being recast into this role where my worth was measured by how available I was to tend his and his mother's needs, rather than as an equal with my own ambitions and responsibilities. I argued back, asking him why, if he had wanted a traditional wife all along, he hadn't married someone who fit that mold. I've never hidden who I am. I've always been upfront to him about my career goals and my passion for my work. I told him plainly that I could never be the kind of wife he was suddenly asking me to be, and I wasn't going to try to conform to his or his mother's expectations. He kept pushing, saying he just wanted me to give this a try by taking a break from work and to see if I liked staying at home like millions of women do around the world. However, I stood my ground, refusing to let them pressure me into giving up something so important to me. I could feel the tension in the air, the disappointment from both of them, but I knew that if I caved now, I'd be sacrificing a part of myself that I'd never get back. In the weeks following that initial conversation, things didn't get any easier for me. In fact, they got worse. My husband and mother-in-law continued to push the idea of me quitting my job relentlessly. It was like they were determined to wear me down. Every day there was some new comment or suggestion, a constant stream of reasons why quitting would be the best decision for us as a family. At first, I was able to simply tune it all out. However, I guess the universe has a cruel way of playing jokes on us. 2 months ago, I discovered that I was pregnant. This was completely unexpected, as me and my husband were not trying to have a baby or anything. When I shared the news with my husband, he was ecstatic, practically beaming with joy as he pulled me into a tight hug. He kept repeating how he was finally going to be happy and that everything was working out exactly the way he wanted. His excitement was palpable, and for a brief moment I wanted to feel it too. But in all honesty, I felt terrified and overwhelmed with doubts. I had lost my parents at a young age, so I worried if I could even be a good parent to our baby. How would I know what to do when I had no example to follow? How would I create a safe and loving environment when I was still figuring out my own path? However, over the next few days, both my husband and mother-in-law assured me repeatedly that I wouldn't be alone in this. They insisted that they would support me through it all, that they would be there for me and the baby every step of the way. They seemed so confident, so sure that this child would bring us all closer. I wanted so badly to believe them, but despite their assurances, I couldn't shake the feeling that with my pregnancy, I would be stepping deeper into the role they envisioned for me, putting aside my needs and dreams in favor of becoming the kind of mother, wife, and daughter-in-law they approved of. I was no longer just navigating a few challenges, but I was now faced with the responsibility of raising a child in a home where I wasn't sure I felt fully supported or understood. As expected, I was pressured again by them to leave my job so I could focus more on pregnancy. I didn't want to fight back any further and put my mental health in jeopardy, so I finally gave in to their demands. I was maybe overwhelmed with my pregnancy hormones, and in a moment of weakness, I started thinking that maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't be so bad to take a break from work. Maybe staying at home and focusing on being there for my family would ease all my tension. I rationalized it to myself, thinking that a temporary break wouldn't be the end of the world. So I sat down with my boss to discuss my situation and finalize the details of my temporary leave. To my surprise, my boss generously offered a temporary work-from-home arrangement, allowing me to continue my role without physically being in the office. While I appreciated the offer and his flexibility, I knew deep down that accepting it might lead to further complications at home. Both my husband and mother-in-law had strong feelings about my role as a homemaker, especially with the baby on the way, and working from home would likely add stress to me. I assured him that this was a temporary step back, and I fully intended to return to my role after I had given birth, if not sooner. I made it clear that I was committed to my position and that this time away was only for a short while. Later, when I went home and informed my husband and mother-in-law of my decision, both of them were overjoyed. They acted as though I had finally come to my senses and made the right choice. My mother-in-law was especially vocal, telling me how much happier I'd be now that I was focused more on my husband and home. So for these past few weeks, I've been staying at home. You could say that I've become a homemaker by now. I handle pretty much all the household chores, cook, clean, and make sure everything runs smoothly. I've settled into this role that my husband and mother-in-law have wanted for me, but if I'm being honest, it feels like a shadow of the life I used to have. Sure, I keep busy, but there's a part of me that feels like I'm slowly withering away from inside. I miss the fulfillment I got from my job, the sense of purpose and independence. I miss being more than just the person who keeps the house in order. What's worse is that I don't feel like things have improved between me and my mother-in-law, despite the fact that I have listened to all her demands. My mother-in-law still finds things about me to criticize and constantly just nags me around the house. One day, she'd complain that I wasn't cleaning the countertops well enough. And the next day, she'd grumble about how my husband deserved a better spread of food for his dinner, implying I wasn't cooking enough to take care of him. It didn't stop there. On the days I dared to sleep in a little, since I felt tired because of my pregnancy, just trying to catch a few extra minutes of rest, she would knock on my door or even barge into the room commenting about how it was lazy of me to just sleep in till late and would demand that I make breakfast for her. I have tried to talk to my husband about this, but he always says the same thing. Things will get better. He keeps repeating that he understands the sacrifice I'm making, and worse yet, he tells me how happy he is that I'm becoming more of a homebody while he works at the office, as if this is something I should feel grateful about. Clearly, he seems oblivious to how much I'm suffering. He's acting like this is some temporary discomfort I just have to endure for a while before everything magically improves. He is content with me being at home, dealing with everything while his mother pushes me to the brink. While he may see my new role as a sacrifice, it is starting to feel like I have sacrificed myself, my identity, and my happiness just to keep the peace in this household that feels less and less like a home. AITA, if I decided to stop being a homemaker and return to my job, even though I promised my husband I would give this a try. Update 1. I felt really guilty when I wrote my story earlier on Reddit, but after reading all your comments, I feel much better about my decision. It's like I can finally breathe and stop punishing myself for my thoughts. I agree that I need to sit down and have a serious discussion with my husband, not just about my returning to work, but also about having my mother-in-law move into a care facility. I can't live with her another day. Update 2. Okay, so it's been almost 2 months since I last updated, and a lot has happened. First of all, when I brought up the idea of his mother moving out, my husband nearly threw a fit. I firmly reminded him, though, that this was my house, the one I paid for and had generously allowed her to stay in. I was done with her little comments and tired of having her constantly in my space. I wanted her out. In the end, my husband begrudgingly agreed, but asked me to give him some time to work things out with his mother. So I graciously agreed. However, a week passed, then 2, and nothing really changed. I don't think he even had a conversation with his mother about this, and I was starting to get frustrated. On top of this, things took an even darker turn when my husband started tightening his control over our household finances. Now that I've left my job and he's the one earning, I didn't want to keep dipping into my savings to pay bills around the house or buy groceries for us. I expected him to cover these expenses. However, he started becoming very strict with money, demanding detailed breakdowns every time he gave me money for anything. If I dared to spend even a little bit on something I liked, whether it was a favorite snack or a brand of food I preferred, he would scold and tell me that I was wasting his money on unnecessary things, as if I had no right to enjoy anything for myself anymore. And then he had the audacity to restrict me to $100 monthly allowance, as though I were a child asking for pocket money. He told me that I needed to stick to this no matter what. It was completely unexpected, and more than anything, humiliating. How could I sustain myself with just $100? When I tried to reason with him by reminding him how I had always given him whatever money he needed when I had a job and he didn't have one, he started acting all offended and told me that I should stop bringing up the past. He argued that I was being unreasonable and told me that I was starting to turn more and more into a gold digger now that he had a good paying job. I was completely taken aback by his response. He continued to reason that since I stayed at home all day, I didn't need money for anything else, so $100 was more than enough for me. It was as if I had become invisible, reduced to nothing more than a housekeeper. The blatant disregard for my well-being, my independence, and my contribution to our life together felt too much for me to handle. He had been the one to force me to be a homemaker, and now he was trying to financially abuse me. It made me realize that I couldn't live like this anymore. I had already sacrificed so much of myself, but this was the final straw. I could no longer continue in a marriage where I was treated like trash. So I have now asked my husband for a divorce. He thinks I'm overreacting and being dramatic because of my pregnancy hormones, but I am completely sure that this is what I want. Since this is my house, I have asked him and his mother to move out by the end of this week. Let's see what happens. Update 3. It's been a little over 2 weeks since I last updated here. After a lot of back and forth, Matt and his mother have finally moved out, and I have filed for divorce this week. Both of them strongly believe I'm being unreasonable for wanting to separate during such a vulnerable time in my life and think I'm going to regret my decision later. Matt repeatedly told me how I was ruining his life by asking for a divorce from him and tried to convince me to change my mind. However, I stood my ground and didn't give in to his pleading. I have to say, ever since they've both left my house, I feel so much happier. Yesterday, I even found myself dancing in the kitchen, listening to my favorite songs after such a long time, while making myself some pasta. I guess I'm slowly starting to feel like myself again. For everyone asking about what will happen to our child, I plan on co-parenting with Matt, regardless of the fact that our relationship has ended. Our baby will have 2 parents, and I've told the same to Matt. As for my job, I plan on returning to work as soon as I've given birth, but for now, I have more than enough savings that I've accumulated over the years to keep me afloat in the coming weeks. I think I'm going to be just fine. Stay tuned for more stories from our girl relationships.